Welcome to lit.happensse, Unpacking Senior English. I'm Adriel.
And I'm Belle.
We're experienced English teachers dedicating to supporting both new and experienced educators in a world in which we are often time poor, to empower our students to excel in their English studies.
If you're an English teacher like us, navigating this curriculum, then this podcast is designed with you in mind. And our mission really is to break down the complexities by unpacking English nationally. Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode. Adriel and I are here today with lit.happensse to bring you everything reading to write. Adriel, hello, welcome back to another lesson. We're going to be covering the rubric today, aren't we? What is
That's
reading to write? Let's get into it. What is it? What does it mean to engage?
Yeah, awesome. Hey guys, how are you? Hopefully you've been enjoying some of the babbling that's been going on in our previous episodes, but hopefully it's been beneficial, and we're so excited to dive into. Yeah, exactly right. We're so excited to dive into our reading to write unit. It's funny, speaking of this, historically creative writing has not been my favorite thing to teach a lot of the times when it comes to my teaching journey, but it's been the one that I've had the most PD in, from learning from our mentors, and then also being able to actually mark what we're going to talk about later on, the craft of writing section in the HSC. So the reading to write unit, I guess, starts off as a stepping stone into that craft of writing unit that we will come across teaching the text in year 12. So I guess the question is, what is reading to write? And I've sort of covered this a little bit here. I think it's necessary to sort of develop this as a module which is designed to ease some of the students into English by engaging them with texts across a variety of modes. So given, written, your visual, your spoken, and, media text. So things like your print, your digital text, your multimedia texts. It's allowing us as teachers to have a little bit of freedom in being able to choose a bunch of texts that will allow us to engage our students with the core of what it is to be in the English course, which is engaging with a variety of texts across different variety of modes. Now, what are some of the specific goals when it comes to reading to write? Well, we need to sort of understand, again, the title. Well, what does it mean to read? And then, is it reading and writing? Is it reading to maybe do something in regards to writing? Yes, we're getting warmer here. It is intentionally written as reading good texts in order to write. So when we think about this, I think the goal of this unit then would then be broken down into 2 or 3 key points, or 2, I would say in particular, your two key focuses. What you're looking to do is you're looking to develop your critical thinking in your students, and we are also looking to develop the creative writing skills, which I think will empower the students to respond thoughtfully to some of the complex ideas, relationships, and narratives that they will come across in both the prelim course and the HSC course. If you think about this a little bit further, if you take this a bit further, what we're going to start to look at in our role as a teacher is aiming to refine the students' abilities to analyze and evaluate. Those are those 2 verbs that we sort of see towards the end of the higher order thinking structure there. But they need to analyze and evaluate how these texts convey meaning in order to apply an understanding, or their understanding, to their own writing. So an understanding of the text that they've read, whatever form or media that you presented, and how they can then use what they've learned and apply it into their own writing. I think that's just a general sort of breakdown of what the reading to write unit entails, and it's really fun. I will say it is really fun, because you can, like I said, experiment with okay, cool, I have these types of students coming in. Let's be honest, most of us will have taught maybe some of these students in year 10 or year 9 or junior school. You'd be like, okay, these are the types of learners that they are. Some of them may be engaged with creative writing. Others might think, well, what's the point? And that's where we as a teacher then play the role in terms of sourcing good literature across these modes and mediums, and trying to engage our students in regards to this. So, yeah. I think that's a nice sort of way to look at what the reading to write unit entails.
Yeah, absolutely, Adriel. I think what you said was really key. Was historically we would look at reading skills and writing skills as like two separate things, or maybe even teachers, we didn't necessarily see the distinction, but students definitely think that. Oh, but I'm just analyzing, so why do I need to write? Well, it's like they didn't see the relationship between the two. And I think the module's really trying to emphasize that. And like you said, it's like the building blocks for the skills that they're going to need to be able to analyze, to evaluate, to interpret, to communicate, to respond. And it's why everyone has to sort of start with this module. This has to be the very first one. Obviously, if you're doing English studies, you're doing something a little bit different, but essentially everyone begins with this reading to write to establish those foundations. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. That's what I always try and say to my students. It's about looking at, like you said, good quality literature, so that's the appropriate springboard. That's where you can see, okay, what are some aspects of that creative writing I can put in my toolkit. Okay, well, why don't we move on then? So I guess we'll just maybe address the question then, well, how does deep reading actually enable a student to then become a better writer? Like, let's talk a little bit more about this relationship. Why do we think deep, critical, engaged reading enables students to be able to respond, whether it's persuasively or creatively, being able to respond more deeply? What do you think?
So I guess we want to look at like this idea of deep reading in the context or the lens of what wide reading is first. So we want the students to be able to look at a variety of texts, and we've mentioned this quite a bit already. Wide reading and reflection, they're probably the key terms. Again, if you're teachers that like to write a few notes down, these are some of the things that you want to start your framework with. Am I exposing my students to wide reading? It's something that we often say in the junior school when we write our little reports. It'll be good if your young person here will read widely at home in order to further develop certain aspects of their skills in relation to English. And then reflection. It's like, well, why do we do this? So why do we look at wide reading? I guess a few of the dot points that we might cover here, things like, it allows students to deepen their engagement with the text and some of the key concepts and themes that are inherent within these texts. We allow ourselves then to explore how language, structure, and style shape meaning. The how, language, structure, and style shape meaning, that's inherent in every single rubric statement that we do come across. So it's something that we should be accustomed to, and we establish this right from the beginning when they start the prelim course. What we also have with wide reading is this ability of students to investigate the impact of context, the purpose, and the audience on writing, which we'll cover a bit deeper as we go further into that deep meaning aspect, which overall then allows students then to enhance their ability to express themselves in both the analytical and the creative forms. Now, what does it mean for us when we're teaching? What does it mean for having this intensive and close reading of quality texts? Well, your goal as a teacher here is to build the student's capacity to read and understand complex texts. How do we do this? Well, it's by analyzing how and why these texts convey these complex ideas, relationships, and things associated with these key complex ideas and relationships. So what are we developing going through that analysis process? And this is that deep meaning that we're looking for as well. We're developing their comprehension, so things like their written expression, so understanding how a text is constructed, what the messages are within the text and how they convey it. We then move on to like the analysis and evaluation phases. The analysis is identifying some of those key literary techniques in regards to the language, form, and structure, and exploring, how these elements then go and lend themselves towards shaping meaning. The evaluation then comes towards this idea of reflection, which we've sort of covered a little bit. And this is assessing the effectiveness of these text components, which we've probably just looked at in the analysis stages. We're looking at the effectiveness of how these components contribute to the overall meaning of the text, which is significant. And then I guess once the students have reflected upon this, then they can interpret further, or they can develop their interpretations even further by looking at some of those underlying concepts and the implications of some of these various narrative sort of choices or structural choices that authors have employed within their good writing, within the development of their text in order to develop a capacity for not only thoughtfully engaging with the quality text, but also being able to then transition towards applying this in their own writing.
Absolutely. I think that's right. Students don't necessarily feel confident writing, let's say, creatively, if they're not confident in reading and interpreting first. So there has to be, and that's where I think you said as well, the wide reading, the focusing on different text types, using different text types to build those critical reading skills before maybe you get to a core text or a suite of text, if that's what your school is choosing to teach. I like to start with even like articles, online articles, before you even can get into, a poem or whatever your text is. I think it's good to, if like backward map as the teacher, if that's your core text and that's your form that you're working with, how can you introduce those aspects early on in this wide reading phase of the topic? And then how can you maybe pad that out? So if you're, doing a text that has a deep focus on, let's say, love and relationships, find some articles to do with that, find some blogs that maybe work with that, and then find some little extracts or poetry that works with that, because you're actually building their capacity to interpret before they even get to their core text. And that's going to give them 100%. That confidence.
100%. And like you've just, like, I love that word confidence, is you want your students being confident when it comes to their own writing, and the way they develop this, like, in essence, we can be overcomplicated, and I probably have sounded overcomplicated, but really, like, you think about yourself as a teacher, if you want to model good writing, what are you going to be turning to in your own time? We're going to be reading good texts that are part of the literary canon, texts that are relevant to what we are teaching. And, the same thing applies, that same transition of skills applies to our students here. It's like, well, we want them to engage with these good texts and understand why they are good, so that they can develop their own writing.
And I think that idea of that purpose, audience, and context, if we're getting them to examine that in good writing, then it will get them to think about it much more deeply, and so that their own pieces that they write have that purpose, have that link to audience, have that context. I think students probably sick of hearing context, but it really is the building blocks of the story that they're going to craft. Like what do you, I find that that's one of the things when students start drafting, and you'll agree to, I know, because we've had this conversation, we'll say to them, but what's like the point of your story? Like what message are you trying to get across? What are you trying to say? And as soon as they say, I don't know, that's where they got to go back and start with that, because the language, the style, the form, that's all there to help bring forth the idea. So if they don't have that, and I think that's why it's really good to look deeply at purpose, audience, and context, so that you can guide the students to start to see through their reading how an author might use their own purpose, their own context, consider their audience, and then have a clear purpose, and have the students try and consider themselves in that light as well, and build that along the way.
And I think, like, when you're looking at like that idea of purpose and audience, again, it's one of the lines again in your rubric statements where we have to help students develop in the composing of these texts that will suit various audiences and various purposes, whether they are writing analytically, creatively, or persuasively. So you've just mentioned this, like, purpose-specific writing means that students need to adapt their writing to meet the needs of specific purposes, whether that be, for an analytical essay, whether that be for a personal response of any sort, discursive writing, creative, reflection, whatever it might be. And by having an awareness of their audience, what they are doing is they are tailoring their language, their tone, the style, to suit these audiences, these respective audiences. Whether, like, sometimes you can sort of say, like, to a student, for example, if one of the big things is in a narrative, they'll often sort of have that beginning, middle, and end. They'll follow that typical narrative arc. Now, some of the text that you explore, you might explore the whole text, but you might decide as a teacher to focus on one particular part of the text, which might facilitate a skill that you're focusing on that particular lesson. And like in the context of, I guess, the whole unit, well, you may be assessing them I know we've done this quite a bit, like assessing them on creative writing for reading to write. That's generally like the assessment that we have.
Yeah, that's the
Now,
very
what is
typical one.
now like what is the word count, I guess, that they generally or typically work with for their assessment? Let's say 600 to 800 words in which they're developing something. Now, if they're not aware of their purpose and their audience of the time, well, it goes back to what you've said. Well, why write? Like, in a way, what are you doing?
Yeah, well, yeah. What are you actually trying to get across? What are you actually trying to say or convey?
Exactly. So it's very important for them to understand their purpose and their audience, and also for us to actually highlight that when it comes to the studying of the text that we're looking at, because we understand then the purpose and audience through the context, as you mentioned, as a building block for understanding meaning. So it's one of those big things that we need to filter into our students' minds. Is it's very important. Contextualize your work, make sure it's got a clear focus, and you've got a clear audience in mind when it comes to your writing. So these are some of the skills that you'll be aware of when you're picking up, how to look like, what am I looking at in these texts? And then we sort of mentioned this. Have a focus. Well, today it's going to be purpose. Well, why the purpose? What is the purpose? What is the reason? And that will then lead on to things like your language, your structure, and the form. It'll help your analysis of that become a lot more clear. And then you'll find your students will be like, okay, cool. This is why this happened, or this is why they've used this like this. So I mean, those are a few things in regards to that.
No, and I really like how you talked about those different text types, like your persuasive, your discursive, your reflective, because you can find a speech and talk about those persuasive elements and recap those speech kind of persuasive features. And then you could go on to the conversation and find more of a discursive article on the similar topic. And, finding a reflective piece, a lot of the big, like your Sydney Morning Herald and all that, they all have those reflective pieces that you can examine with your students. Even if you're just starting to get them to just wide read, to get an assessment yourself as their teacher for what they can identify and what they can't. Because it's a very specific to the class as well. I find different years, my students need very different things from their wide reading skills. Maybe they are really good with context, but they have a bit more trouble identifying purpose, or maybe they get all that stuff and it's actually looking at how language is crafted. So I think that's a really great strategy. If you're like, new teacher, what do I do? Okay, you know what your core text is going to be. What is a key kind of issue there? Go and find an example of a couple of different text types with a similar topic and just see how your students go. Get an assessment or a judgment on what works, what they get, and then what we need to fill in the gaps, I guess. Because the topic's really meant to upskill them, isn't it? So that they're not having to start and do all this again when it's time to do craft of writing in year 12. Like if you're going to start establishing those critical reading and writing skills, it's now, isn't it?
Exactly right. And I think I think also, just to add to that, it's very important that you spend the time to get the students to understand the language in the rubric. We've sort of hashed over some of it a little bit here, but we're covering some of the key terms for us as teachers, but you need to make sure that they know that rubric. Like, I can't emphasize that enough. Is take the time out, spend it. You can always make up time later on when it comes to your text, but there's no use jumping into your texts without the students understanding why they are having to read through these texts.
So true.
The why is littered in the why is littered in the rubric, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually an excellent point you make, because a lot of teachers like to start with giving the students their own opportunity to reflect on what reading and writing means.
Yes.
What do they think reading is? What does it mean to write? What is the relationship? In what ways do they read? In what ways do they write? Getting them to think about maybe moments where they felt success in their reading and writing skills, and maybe moments where there was a challenge. Because I think with this particular module, if the students aren't reflecting on what their reading and writing skills are now, well, then what are they going to do along the way when they're meant to be improving and building on and personalizing those skills for them?
Exactly. Yeah.
Shall we move into then how okay, so let's say we've established, the bones and the basics of this is the module. Let's do some, wide reading. Let's examine our skills. Let's now move into how do we get the students to develop like those analytical reading skills where they're doing a close reading and they're breaking down maybe the structure, the style, the language. What can teachers and students do in that regard?
So I guess, again, like we go back to like some of the definitions. So I think, again, we refer to the rubric point here where it says, we're looking to enhance the students' abilities to respond to both texts in critical and creative ways, okay, which shows you that deep reflection on their writing process. And if we're looking at this, you also go into or delve into some of these terms where it's like, we look at the thematic, the aesthetic, the stylistic, and the conceptual engagement with these texts. And I'll probably spend a little bit of time just delving into these. But the first thing that they're looking to develop is that critical writing skill. Yep. So if you're looking at developing, let's say, a thoughtful essay or a critical essay, well, what are you going to be looking at within that specific text or exemplar text that you're giving to your students, in order to develop that capacity for critical writing? So crafting these thoughtful essays or arguments that they analyze within a text might support, claims, maybe with the evidence and analysis. When we start to look at some of those elements of good critical writing, well, we question that sort of stuff, don't we? And we're delving into that deep analysis. Same thing with creative writing. What makes a what makes a good creative text or imaginative piece of writing?
Yeah, why is it effective?
Yeah, exactly right. Like, why are we sometimes recreating the wheel where it's like, once upon a time, such and such, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Whereas you'll find the more innate sort of students and teachers will focus on moments within a text when it comes to this sort of imaginative writing. So they rewrite maybe a scene or a part which was filled with tension. You might look at atmosphere and the opening scenes. You look at character motivations, and this is what will deepen your students' engagement with the text. Like it's those lenses through which we look at these texts in. Awesome. So I guess it's important for us now to move into a little bit of, what it means by the thematic, the aesthetic, the stylistic, and conceptual engagement with texts. Now, we're looking at sort of some of this, deeper understanding. How do we engage analytically with the text and all that sort of stuff? Well, the students obviously have to engage with the text themes, the aesthetics, the styles, and the concepts to better understand some of the complex ideas, and then provoke that thoughtful reflection, which is, that part of the analysis that we are trying to foster within our students. Now, if we start off with the thematic engagement, it's quite simple. Yeah, it's understanding and evaluating some of those key themes. I've been teaching The Great Gatsby, for example, and if I'm looking at that text, well, I might look at things like social class, corruption, the American dream, the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, some of these ideas, which will then, once I understand that and their relevance to both the text and the world, the students then get a better understanding of what is happening within the text and how this theme has been developed. Themes are pretty simple. I think most of us as teachers, we know how to look at the main idea in a text and we know how to get our students to engage with. And, that will probably be driven by the context work that we put in with our students right from the beginning. We then look at the next terms, which are, again, innate within this prescriptions document here, the aesthetics and the stylistics, or the stylistic elements of the text. So we need to analyze these components, don't we? And how do we analyze this? Well, we're assessing how some of these aesthetic qualities of the text, so what are these aesthetic qualities? Well, this could be things like the imagery, maybe things like those extended metaphors, motifs, the tone of the text, and look at how these contribute to its overall impact. The text. So something like Gatsby, again, as just an example here, you'll say the impact when it was first released was not great. But after World War II, when about 150,000 American soldiers got a copy of it and, used this text as a form of escapism, I would look at it, during their time in World War II. Well, now we're starting to see its impact, aren't we? Okay.
Yeah.
How some of these key stylistic and aesthetic elements allow for people to escape the reality in which they're living and, you know, transition into this effective, really good writing, which we see through
absolutely.
Fitzgerald's Gatsby.
Yeah.
We then move on to the last sort of part, and that's a conceptual exploration. And I love conceptual exploration of text because it gets students to think broadly about not only the text that they're studying, but also about the many different facets that are involved in the construction of a text. So when we're looking at conceptual exploration of text, we're looking at, you know, how the text explores, or how the text, should I say, communicates some of its abstract ideas, the ideas that are beyond the surface level ideas, which we might look at when we cover themes. Now, these could include things like identity, freedom, illusions, and these are different sort of parts of the text that you will definitely look at when we're looking at an analysis or that analytical skill that the students you want to foster within your students, in order to get them to appreciate the text. Because it's not just, hey, look for this metaphor, or look at this simile, or look at this piece of alliteration. It's you're connecting it to some of those key elements within the rubric, aren't you? It's like, well, it has to connect to an idea. And these bigger ideas are the things that we want to see reflected through their writing. And then again, out of all of that, you'll start to see an increased control of language and expression, which will come through, you know, an expansion of maybe their lexicon. The grammar and punctuation will start to improve as they start to look at these good texts. And I think the thing that we don't often mention is, you know, this idea of distinctive voice used to be one of the units in the old HSC there, you know, voices. And what we're starting to see is the development of these unique writing styles which suit the context, the purpose, and the audience, which is what we've just, you know, harped on about in the last 10 or so minutes. We want students to understand that distinct voice because, you know, we want their pieces to then have that distinct voice. What is it that's truly reflecting themselves? You know, are they writing, for example, a creative piece that is inspired by a core text that they've studied, but how have they engaged with some of the key voices within it? And I think this is a way in which we can start to look at, you know, developing those analytical skills that the texts really facilitate for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, you know, that idea of the aesthetic, like you said, looking at some, you know, really big, really obvious stylistic features, that is a bit of a hallmark for that text or a hallmark for that author. And, you know, use the opportunity. I think we think sometimes when we analyze or when we're trying to close read, we can only do that through actual like analytical based activities and discussions, but you can still bring that forth in your creative approaches too. Like if let's say, you know, that text has a major motif, well, get students to do a little writing activity where they pick a moment or a scene and they switch that motif and they replace it with something else. How does that, you know, change the way that the idea is being communicated? You know, if they were offered to play around and they offered a perspective of maybe a secondary character or a new character that might contextually fit in, how does that then change the approach? So I think, sometimes it depends on students as well. Some of them will get it really quickly doing that more analytical interpretation. And some sometimes need to do it with that more engaging, crafting, creative way. So that I think if they can see the difference, because when they start to see the difference, they can on one hand consider how it has impacted the meaning of their text, and then also start to get them to consider, okay, so as an author, they made that deliberate choice to have that motif because they wanted this conceptual outcome.
Yeah, exactly. So that's it's definitely something that we'll develop. I like that idea that you've mentioned, is like through that process of crafting. So like I mentioned earlier, like you might focus on one or two of these elements and be like, well, how is this found within this portion of a text that you might be studying? Really to hone into those skills. And again, it depends on your students, your cohorts, you know, how you're going, but really break it down into those little chunks. Don't go holistically. And sometimes we can get caught up in the busyness of the school term where we think, well, we just have to get through this text and we just have to get through X, Y, and Z. But if you're not building these fundamental skills and understanding some of this, you know, these key analytical components, well, you're doing not only yourself a disservice, but you might be doing the students a little bit of a disservice, because you're brushing over some of the key components of what the rubric is asking of us, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a good point there where it depends on your class. So consider your scaffolding. You might have a class where you can individually ask them to have an independent close read and see what they come up with. You might have a class that works best in small groups or pairs. And, as the teacher, you will know what your big stylistic elements are. You can break them up. This group looks at this element. That group looks at the context. That group looks at the extended metaphor. And then, like a jigsaw, bring them all back and get them to share. And, on top of that as well, when you're thinking about that engagement and that crafting, it's okay sometimes to have a lesson where you break away from the core text and just get them to write. I know like you said, the term gets away from you, and sometimes we think, I just got to keep plodding along. But if there's like something I can see that they're not connecting with and not getting, it's okay to then pause, have a standalone lesson as the teacher, scaffold as you need, guide as you need. Don't, because like you said, if you're just kind of breezing through, then you might not get that engagement in the end. And then that's going to be reflected in the quality of what the students produce in that eventual assessment, right?
And I guess the good thing about the prelim course is it's the preliminary course, This is where you will experiment and try new things with your class, because this is where you want to build that capacity for students then to take off into Mod C when we get to that in the Year 12 course. So don't be afraid.
It's a great way to get to know your students too. Like I know every time I start with a new Year 11, it's like, okay, I got to learn names again. I got to learn what they know, what they don't know. I got to learn how they engage with each other. And I think this unit lends itself quite nicely, because you've got so much, you said at the start of this podcast, freedom to pick texts that you think will engage them, freedom to create activities that you think can really work for them. Even giving students options. Sometimes what I like to do is, let's say I'm doing one stylistic feature, I give them an option of 3 different activities. In one could be a more analytical, one could be more creative, one could be more reflective, and sometimes giving them the option to engage with that element in the way that they kind of learn best or that they feel confident with. And then eventually they will start loosening up and trying new things, I think. All right. So I think we've talked a fair bit about like analyzing and, that close reading. I think you've done really well there. So what about now when we move off from the students have done their close reading now, and now they need to start reflecting on their writing skills and start to put into practice how what they've done or what they've learned in the close reading might be able to support them in crafting, let's say, their own creative pieces. So let's think of, well, what are some like self-reflecting or writing activities that we might get the students to do that helps them to move forward to eventually crafting their own narrative?
Cool. So I've sort of like touched on this a little bit when it comes to reflection. When we're looking at our own text, always have your pen and paper out, your highlighters, your little post-it notes. Get students to annotate the text if possible, if it's their own copies. Don't want you getting in trouble if it's a school one. But get them really engaging with the ins and outs of it. So I generally say to my students, listen to an audiobook, listen to the text once or twice if we're doing like a big novel. So for example, like The Great Gatsby. Because then the second time through, we're going to focus on key parts of the text, and we'll go through and deconstruct those key elements of the text that we can then apply to our own writing. So I guess for us as teachers, you need to make sure you know your text inside out. That's the first step.
Because you might need to offer some suggestions of, well, here are some key structural techniques, here are some key ideas. You will have students who need you to bridge that gap for them before they can start off on their own.
That's right. And even your higher order kids, like, your kids that are excelling might challenge you a little bit and ask you, like, I know one of the things that I used to do was, one of the old adages was when we were teachers, like, you're always one lesson ahead of your students. But I challenge that a little bit through my sort of experience as well. No, you want to be at least 2 to 3 lessons minimum ahead of your students, because
Yep.
your students that are excelling, or the ones that want to be challenged and go further, will definitely want you to be able to offer some of these suggestions. And whether that be through critical reading that critiques some of the text that you're exploring, whether it be through your own critical readings and your own analysis, just make sure you are well known with your text. Like that's probably a good sort of thing. But how do we make these connections? Well, we've sort of covered this a little bit, and what are we reflecting on? So again, we start off with those key themes. So identifying some of those key themes within the text that you're studying, or the variety of text that you have offered off to your children there. We look at the language features depending on the medium or the mode of the text, and the structural choices. These are the things that you really want to probably make the connections with when we're looking at some of this wide reading. They're 3 ins.
You're right.
And they're 3
because if they don't
ins.
see it, that's right. Because if they don't see it, how can they in some ways reproduce, or at least use it to inform what they're going to be writing?
So
absolutely.
like if the students, like if you're looking at starting points, again, I know I've sort of been focusing and harping on the conceptual elements, but remember, this is a starting point. So identify your key themes. How have they explored this theme? What is the function of this theme within this text? Then you then move into like your language features. Well, if it's a novel, well, what are the elements of prose maybe that are allowing some of this meaning to be shaped? And what are the medium specific or the mode specific features, structural choices in the last little part there that lend themselves to the shaping of meaning, which you can highlight to the students, which they can then convey through their own writing. And that's our role.
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's our role as a teacher.
I think so, because we do have to, at the end of the day, they are young adults, and whether they like or don't like English, there's a whole world competing with them, and we need to offer that guidance. And I really like that idea of, the form and the style. You could have a lot of fun with that and have students debate over the best or the most important theme in the text. Or the best stylistic element. Sometimes I even say to my guys, I want you to think and create a top 3. What were your top 3 themes or ideas, your top 3 moments, and your top 3 techniques that you just really stood out for you? Because often I find when they're trying to transition into the craft of writing, because we all have our own style, don't we? It's like you said, developing that voice, and what might hook one reader when examining a text might not necessarily be the thing that engages the other person who's reading this. So because we all have things we favor, right? We all have ideas we favor. We all have techniques we prefer, or techniques that we just see and we get and it stands out. So I always say to my guys, start there, and that's your toolkit. And then when you're moving forward to eventually create your own, you've got some ideas that you can work with, some ways that you might engage the audience, and some form or stylistic techniques that you're reasonably comfortable with using. But then, as the teacher, we will always offer them opportunities to workshop, and we will model. Then when students are then getting into how they actually command their written expression to then craft their own writing, what are some strategies I think we should talk about, some strategies we've used in the classroom that give the students confidence to craft whatever piece. I know we said it earlier, traditionally in this module, you're looking at a creative response that asks you to interpret or springboard some way off of your core text, and then reflect on what you actually did as a writer to craft and sort of self-analyze your piece. So what are some strategies now we do when we're getting to the part where students are now trying to craft their own thoughtful, response as like a summation of this topic and what they've learned?
Yeah. Okay. So again, like this is all like dependent on your class.
Definitely.
That's probably the big things. But I will highly encourage this. We live in an age right now where, as much as we think that students are not creative beings, they are mega creative. So make use of technology. I think we can start off like some of the things. Actually, let's wind back a little bit. Some of the things that I often like to start off with is just a simple pen and paper. You'll find your students, if they want to write like a good, effective, creative piece, for example, they'll spend 3 hours doing, perfect introduction. And by the end of it, it's still not the perfect introduction, but they've just spent so much time trying to, just craft the perfect thing right off the bat because they just want to be one and done. Really get the students to get encouraged with the process of drafting. So, you might start off with an idea. Well, what are some of the key ideas, as you've just mentioned? You get them into like pair share sort of groups where it's like, all right, individually think about, well, these are the general concepts that the teacher has given that we want to create a piece on, and we want to explore a moment of tension, for example, within the recreating of a scene within maybe a prose text that they might have read. And she might give them like a specific element. Well, here's a concept. These are the different thematic sort of sub parts of that concept. Well, get them to just brainstorm. Like, it's a simple thing, brainstorming. We often neglect this. And get whatever their thoughts are out onto the piece of paper. Because if they're trying to keep it all in here, and then it's like 10 minutes later and you've moved on to another phase. What was that great idea? I guarantee you this, the kid that's written down those ideas, oh, look, I've actually written this down. I thought it wasn't relevant, but it is relevant now.
Absolutely.
So you might start off with a simple brainstorming and getting them to pair share, really encouraging them to talk with each other. They do like talking. And then like I said, if you are looking at, trying to engage the modern student, you got to think about things like they want a change in activity. I think the capacity or the attention span is like 7 seconds these days. If you look at your YouTube shorts, your Instagram reels, or whatever it might be, students have a very short attention span. Now that's difficult when it comes to reading some of these great texts because you need a fairly long attention span. That's the conundrum that we face as teachers.
That's right.
But your phase where you're doing the teacher-directed stuff, you consider it. They've been listening to you for 15, 20, 30 minutes. Now, when it comes to those activities, I would suggest breaking them down into like small 2, 3, maybe 4-minute activities where you're building particular skills. Not putting an emphasis on perfection, but just getting your writing out there when it comes to creative writing in particular. Okay, and you might give them certain elements. You really have to guide this, though, as the teacher. So I want to develop a good opening to a piece, or what do I want? I want a good introduction, which has great atmosphere, purpose established, the setting is being developed, and maybe the introduction of character. There might be like 4 simple things that you're considering. Well, are you going to do all 4 of them at the same time? No. Break it down. 2 minutes. Okay, what are some of the things in creating good atmosphere? Show, don't tell, one of those key principles. And just get them to jot down some of those key points,
Yeah, I love
then
that.
you move on to the next phase. Okay, character. Well, what sort of character is going to be embedded in this piece? What sort of tension is going to be embedded in this piece in terms of the atmosphere? 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 8 minutes. They should have like a basic structure on how to do a good introduction there. After which you might then get them to go on and maybe, like we're doing a podcast right now, you've got the capacity for them to maybe record their thoughts. This is why I'm considering doing this. And this is the reason, that I'm doing this, because I've read this in the exemplar text that we've read. And I want to sort of reflect or mimic this. Get them to really hear their thoughts. Students like recording themselves. It's like they don't like putting themselves up in front of the classroom, albeit they put themselves all over the internet with a lot of the social media that's out there now. But they love recording themselves. They do like hearing the sound of their own voice. Like, it's some of those things that you will get and gather with your own students. But I found you start simple, break it down into those small activities. I think getting them to do a 15 to 20 minute activity right from the beginning, where it's like, hey guys, here's your activity. Off you go and write an introduction. Like, what are you doing? You know what I mean? Like,
you're right.
How do I do this?
They really need like the bones. The bones, or like at least a checklist. Yeah, absolutely. Why can't you model it on the board with the class? This is how we make a rough plan. And, then eventually students could go off into groups or do that. I even like you tend to do it more at the start of the term, is I take them outside and just a very basic, like, what do we see? What do we hear? Like, engage all the senses. try and make some descriptive statements out of that, and then use that for, a one paragraph opening where a character is in a certain environment. Like use those little things. Sometimes I think it's just like you said, giving them time to pause and have a think for themselves, what they consider, what they like, and moving forward with that. But I think the most important thing you said is there's no right or wrong way. It's all dependent on your class. And look, let's be honest here, it's all dependent on our skills. Like as teachers, if I reflect when I was a student, I hated creative writing. No way did I want a creative writer. I just wanted to be analytical all the time, and there'll be other teachers that say vice versa. So there is an element when you are teaching this, I have found as the teacher, I have to up my game. I have to learn those elements of writing. I have to be able to do what I'm asking the students to do, because if I can't do it and then they do it and I'm trying to give them feedback, I found it really difficult, especially that very first time you teach it and you do it. You're sort of trying to do all those things at once. You're trying to engage, and it's a hard job, isn't it? You're trying to engage. 100%. You're trying to, like you said, be 3 steps ahead. You're trying to get your head around it all. So I think it's really important that whatever you're going to ask them to do, that you're prepared or can also do that as well. And then I think that will make you so much more equipped when it's feedback time, when you're helping them craft their stories. Because if there's an inconsistency in, let's say, characterization, not only will you be able to identify it, but you might be able to suggest ways that they could rectify it. Right?
Yeah, no, 100%. I will mention this. I don't know about you guys, but like as a teacher, sometimes you just wish that students will just reflect on the notes that they've taken instead of, hey, miss, can you check this? Or, hey, sir, can you check this? You're like, hey, you've actually written some great notes on this. Go back and reflect on this. And this is where you need to foster that sort of, those little skills where they are doing, like I said, those little pair shares or, engaging with each other. That peer-centered learning, it does become very important. Because I have been guilty of this a lot of the time. I'm not saying I'm perfect or anything like that. I'm far from it. But each year I sort of reflect on my practice. Yeah, exactly right. I reflect on it and I'm just like, you know what? As the students are now starting to get more and more in line with their own voices, which is what we're trying to facilitate. Why am I stumping it a lot of the time with just a straight teacher-directed lesson? So I'm still crafting that. And I've been finding like what you see is when they talk with each other, they then become less inclined to just then say, hey, miss, or hey, sir. They develop a bit of confidence when they talk amongst each other and they have that peer-centered learning and they can talk with each other about what effective writing might look like within a text that they're looking at or studying. And that will be beneficial for you because you can then say, okay, guys, find someone in the room, get them to provide like 5 or 6 great feedback points or feed forward points, maybe 1 or 2 things that you want to see. And that avoids you then having to look at those first drafts. So by the time the writing comes to you, then you've got a more refined piece of work that isn't just like, where do I start giving feedback to this student?
That's great. No, you're so right. Where do I begin? And having like a checklist, ask the student to consider, have I used atmosphere to introduce the setting? Have I introduced a character? Have I given that character a sense of voice? Like getting them to go through that checklist, because it's really actually interesting to see what the students feel they're doing well or not doing well. Sometimes that aligns with what you think as a teacher. Sometimes it's opposite. They might think, oh, this is great. Like what I've done is perfect, so sometimes it gives you that opportunity to have that, like you said, the more direct conversation as opposed to all the different things that could be fixed. Let's focus and narrow down and tighten things up little by little.
Yeah, no, exactly right.
I love that.
Exactly right.
I love that. All right. So I think we've covered a lot there. We sort of maybe rambled a little bit, guys, with reading to write. But I think that's just because it's so reflective of all the different things that you could do in this unit, and in some ways there's beauty in options. And then I know for like a lot of new teachers, all those options can be quite daunting. Because you're like, where do you start? Well, if you know that that's going to be your core text because that's what your school likes to teach in that term, backward map from that, whatever skills or strategies you're going to teach them along the way, try and embed that in the right wide reading. Try and get your own notes and your own self up to speed as to the things you're going to analyze with them, the ideas, the stylistic, the concepts, and, you know, come up with some activities that you're then going to use to help students springboard off of that. What do you think, Adriel?
I think, like when you're looking at like the reading to write, I guess we can leave you with like 4 or so key points here. You know, what you're looking at doing with your students in particular. Remember, you're looking at developing their critical thinking and also their creative expression through this this unit with that close engagement with some of these divisive sort of texts. You're also then, number 2, then looking to strengthen their ability to, you know, analyze, you know, how some of these language forms, the language itself and the context then shape meaning within some of these exemplary texts. So as you were mentioning just there, you know, you need to make sure that you know your texts and you know what you're teaching well, so that, you know, it's a key simple thing. And sometimes, like I said, in the business, I've been guilty of it as well. Sometimes you're like maybe even an hour before you go into your lesson, okay, what was it that I'm teaching? Like, just be mindful of that. Just be mindful of that. I'm not judging or anything like that, because I'm definitely been part of that. But you know, we're trying to engage students with good texts, so we need to understand the good elements of these texts that we are looking at. And then also remember the key purposes. You know, you're enhancing writing skills for the students, and we're also encouraging reflective practices. So we're getting them to, you know, consider their own writing processes and development, I guess, as the overarching sort of purpose of this whole unit. You know, how is their writing process and, you know, the development of this writing process being benefited through the study and the reading of quality texts? And I think that in essence is what, you know, sets the foundation then to leapfrog not only into craft of writing, which I've been sort of mentioning, but we've been mentioning critical expression as well here. You think about it, we do a critical study in Mod B. Mod A, when you're looking at, you know, the textual conversations there, you are still having a critical lens into those texts. So we are building a lot of these skills. I should say, I've just mentioned 2 year 12 modules. Apologies, not your 11 ones, but all of this is very significant, and this is why we start off with the reading to write unit.
Yeah, it's the perfect unit to go over, refine, and then examine their persuasive writing and their analytical writing skills and reading skills, and also the creative, and set that foundation moving forward in the following units. And like you said, it is year 11, it is term 1. This is like your opportunity to have a little fun with it too, and use it to get to know your students. You know, use your digital text as well. There's some really great ones. Like I always think of SBS as the boat. Which I love, because it's got the actual textual narrative, but it's playing around with the visuals and the sounds. And like you said, our students are in this really, you know, social media driven world. Why can't they look at all those modes and break them down? How would the text, how would the meaning shift without this element or that mode? Or in what ways is it richer because we've added that? Like have some fun and play around with it. And, you know, I think that's sort of probably the less, like the easiest module for you to do that before, you know, your HSC starts and you start to panic and think about that end goal. You know, I think that's the best way that I felt I learned, just trying new things. And if it didn't work, that was okay. Having a backup and supplementing, and you will get there, because I think it can be daunting because it's so open-ended, but try and look at it as, well, there's so much possibility then, because it's open-ended. You really have the capacity as a teacher to drive, you know, the learning that's taking place, and help develop the confidence that way.
Yeah, no, 100%. And like, you know, have fun. It's your first unit. It's your first unit, year 11. Get to know your kids, get to know their writing styles, and this will establish a great relationship with you guys, with you and your class moving forward. This is
so true.
You know, it'll allow you to, I know it's probably bad of me to say this, but like weed out maybe some of the ones that are the wrong candidates for this course.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right. Yes, absolutely. Because everyone needs to be in the right space for them, you know, in the course that's going to help them to achieve great results. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's right. Because that's at the end of the day, we want our students all achieving the best results they can in the HSC. I know we often put a lot of emphasis on the number, but I've come to the realization that, well, it's not the number that matters. It's what skills are we actually teaching the students, and
Yes.
what can they
Yes.
carry with them beyond
Yes.
year 12 into university, into
What are they getting out
work.
of it? Yep.
Exactly. And that's why we're getting them to look at these skills. This is English, isn't it? In essence, it's a skills-based unit. It's not a content-driven
Yes.
unit. So, yeah, in saying that, there, sometimes we fall into the trap, as we mentioned through the pod, of trying to get through content. But remember, in essence, the rubric is about developing skills. And
Yep.
if you've got that down pat, don't stress. You guys will be able to pull it. You'll be doing great jobs, and we'll be expecting to hear from you when you do get your great results. It'll be fantastic.
Yeah, we'd love to hear and see kind of what approaches you've put in or activities you've thought that really worked and really helpful. As we're really conscious of building a community here, aren't we, Adriel? Like just all of us
100%.
helping each other, sharing our knowledge, what works, what maybe could work better, and moving forward that way together. Yeah,
and in saying that, like, again, Belle's been doing a wonderful job developing some great resources. Please make sure to check out the samples that we'll be attaching to each of these episodes, and then be sure to like, subscribe, follow us along in this journey as we are trying to develop this content. And hopefully we'll have our page sorted soon, so we will have our full resources available. And if you'd like to support us further,
hopefully.
if you'd like to support us further in this journey, if you liked our samples, there's no pressure. But if you like them and you do want to continue supporting this little project and this journey, feel free to check out our resources, and we'll have more details on that coming up shortly as well. So it's looking bright. The future is bright for us, and yourselves in your classrooms. We're excited for everyone. We're excited to be able to help as best we can as well.
Absolutely. All right, take care, guys. See you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.